How we doing, guys? My name is James Comey, and welcome to my critical reflection vlog. Today I will be discussing two articles which I have read and thought about a lot. The first one being "What the Fuck is Queer Theory" by Eugene Walters, and the second one is "Rebel Girls, Your Handy Dandy Map to the Feminist Movement." So this first article, exactly what it sounds like, is an introduction into queer theory. And essentially, the author describes being queer as a way to disrupt society's views of what is normal, per se. Normal is often described as, the gender binary of being a man and a woman. We all have societal expectations, at least in Western European American society, to act and perform because, as they cite, Judith Butler in the article says that gender essentially is a performance. We're all playing into a system of how are we supposed to act, how are we supposed to look, how are we supposed to talk, down to very minor mannerisms in the way that we express our genders, which is a very European, Western concept, but I'll get into that later. And it's funny, one of the examples that they use in the article is that FDR, who we all know is the famous president who served 4 terms, World War II era, wore a dress until he was 6, which there's a famous photo online of it. But the whole point of showcasing that photo is that essentially gender is something that we, whether it's yourself choosing to do it, or in this case FDR's parents, I'm assuming, it's something that you choose to perform, it's something that you choose to put out, whether it's willingly or something that you do because it's something that society expects you to do. And these gender norms that we've developed over time, like I said, are heavily influenced through Western European society, specifically in the United States, Anglo-Protestant ideals that have heavily influenced our gender roles, again, the gender binary. And religion specifically has played into maintaining sexuality or attempting to influence sexuality among people in our society. Now, obviously, this means that heteronormativity, or being heterosexual, is essentially what is considered to be normal in society. Now, this article also goes into how this, being hetero, plays into capitalism and how they go hand in hand. And essentially how men and women being expected to, maintain their respective gender norms, being straight, is actually a way for capitalism to influence reproduction among, people. And essentially, this article kind of blew my mind because I never thought about it this way, but essentially capitalism promotes heteronormativity and heterosexuality because the more children that you produce, the more the labor force grows, the more essentially units of labor the corporations and the bourgeoisie are going to have to, enact production and make more money. So that is also one of the main points of the article. So this article also goes into talking about different forms of resistance against the gender binary, the norm, the societal norms, what it means to be a man and woman, and one of the concepts that they talked about is gender fuck, which is essentially partaking in actions or expressions that violate the gender norms, which is, for example, drag, something that we all recognize, or being androgynous, which androgynous means the blending of masculine and feminine in not a particular gender, but, for example, you can, be a very masculine man, but you can also wear very feminine clothing, or you can't exactly tell from looking at someone or the way they act which gender they are, is the way that I would describe androgynous. And essentially these, gender fuck is a form of protest to the, the heteronormative norm of reproduction, of basically the entire system that Europeans, white people, have established in the Western Hemisphere, in the Western world in general. And gender fuck is just a method to disrupt that system in like a form of protest. Uh, the article also said that queers are in a position to disrupt the reproductive norms of heteros, which essentially is not boycotting but protesting having children in general, which I see as, the way I thought about this was prohibiting from having children because you're gay, to keep from supplying the labor workforce. I didn't really understand that concept, right away, because I do agree that deciding to be a parent is a choice, and not all, even hetero couples partake in this. And I know the norm is that most hetero couples do have children. However, I don't think that, I'm not sure if it was an argument saying that queers should go out and try to purposely not have children. I mean, I don't know what that means if they don't adopt children, but I don't know. I didn't really understand that. But another point that the article made, another quote that I thought was interesting, is they said, "Boys are raised to be heterosexual, manly men only for the sake of conquering distant, resource-rich lands." And I thought this was interesting because the article also went to go talk about two-spirit genders, which they claim is a third form of gender that a lot of Native American societies or nations had in the United States prior to European colonization. Now, one criticism I have of this article is I think that this, the concept, I've heard of the concept of two-spirit gender before, and I'm not sure if it's intended to be an overgeneralization, but I think it is an overgeneralization mainly because, you can't generalize and say that all Native Americans practice, or not, didn't practice, but had this concept of a third gender. Now, I think it's very possible that a lot of Native American peoples did expand beyond the gender binary, because I think that is a Western Europe concept. However, I think with colonization and settlement of white people in the United States, and not even the United States, the entire Western Hemisphere was settled by white people, and whether the native peoples in that land were either assimilated into that culture, like Mexico, or if they were completely annihilated, like the United States. The Europeans are the ones that wrote the history. They're the ones that are telling us now, the concepts and the frameworks and the culture and the lives and sexualities of the native peoples. I think it'd be naive not to be skeptical of what they said, or what they these concepts of sexuality. So I do acknowledge the two-spirit gender as being a generalization for violating the gender binary that have been brought by Western Europeans, but I don't think it's necessarily something that should be focused in too narrowly when trying to describe indigenous feminism, for example, which is actually something I'm going to get to in the next article. The next article is called "Rebel Girls, Your Handy Dandy Map to the Feminist Movement," and it introduces the reader into the different waves of feminism. We got the first wave feminism, which is 1800s, 1920. Your prominent suffragettes. Is that right? I don't know. Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, Sojourner Truth. These are the women we learned about in history class, mostly white women who were essentially advocating for the right to vote, which they eventually got in the 19th century. 20th century, 1920 through the 19th Amendment. Another milestone that they achieved was that the National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed, and that essentially wraps up that first wave of feminism. Now, the second wave, we hear of famous women such as Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedman, who essentially demanded for a cultural revolution as opposed to a legal revolution for women's rights in the United States. Now, aside from, there were legal victories for women in this era, including, Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, access to birth control and abortion through Roe v. Wade, Supreme Court in Griswold versus Connecticut, Women's Educational Equality Act, and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. So these are a lot of legal victories that women did win through the second wave of feminism. However, women were also advocating against the individualistic feeling that women had at this point in time, or it was more of a feeling of isolationism, I would say, where women were expected to conform to a narrow set of gender norms and positions in society. Because women, as you know, were had to stay in the kitchen, and were not expected to, take on occupations that were strenuous or make more income than men. And these advocates attempted to, push back against this, resist this, and try to reform culturally the notions that we have about the role women should have in society, whether that's in the family, in the workplace, politically as well, representation in Congress. These are all very, very key elements that these women were trying to advocate for in the second wave of feminism. I also read about Phyllis Schlafly. I did not know who this was until I read this article. She was a very staunch opponent of the Equal Rights Amendment, which is actually, I watched a John Oliver about this the other night. The Equal Rights Amendment was a legal attempt to constitutionally protect equality between men and women, just to make it harder for people like Donald Trump to be able to use because if the Equal Rights Amendment is not in the Constitution, then it means that it's very easily overturned through laws or whatever that may be. But basically, Phyllis Schlafly, as a staunch opponent of the Equal Rights Amendment, advocated a lot of rhetoric against it, even saying stuff such as a divorced man and woman having absolute equality under law would turn into each one would gain, when gaining custody of an equal number of children through a divorce. Basically, if a man and woman were getting divorced and they had 4 children, each one would get 2 under the Equal Rights Amendment, is the type of rhetoric that she was espousing on media, on mainstream media outlets. And her efforts were actually very successful because to this day, like I said, the Equal Rights Amendment has not been ratified by one state. I think we needed 37 states to do it, or I think it was 38, and only 37 have done it up until this point. And most of them have been southern states. So it makes sense. And presently we're in the third wave of feminism, which is emphasizing the importance of intersectionality and inclusivity. So, a lot of you have probably heard of white feminism, which is essentially feminism and advocating for all those rights I just mentioned, but exclusively for white women. It has no acknowledgement of indigenous women, Chicana women, African American women, LGBT women, trans women. White feminism is essentially advocating for the status quo, straight, white, Christian woman who is often, higher class. It's crazy because intersectionality and introducing all these other types of feminism into, traditional feminism completely redefines it because, white feminism started in, like I said, the 1820s, 1800s. If you include indigenous women, then that brings back feminism to 1492 and before that. How were women, indigenous women resisting European colonization, and how does their struggle play into the overall goal of women to, achieve their goals overall? So this article did go through all the different types of feminism. Liberal feminism is the one that we always think about, which I equate to white feminism, which is only focusing on equal pay, abortion, and to sexual violence, and attempting to advocate for legal and political rights. Obviously, my favorite to talk about was indigenous feminism, and this article attempted to argue that modern feminist movement was co-opted from Native women by white women, which essentially means that Native women should not practice feminism because feminism acknowledges the white woman's struggle in the United States. And essentially, indigenous feminism attempts to actively resist not only the United States, Canada, and all these other post-colonial Western societies that came about in the 15th, 16th centuries, but essentially the idea of a nation state, the idea of a country, which was not a thing to indigenous Americans before the arrival of Europeans, is something that should be resisted altogether. Essentially, there's no way for indigenous women to be successful in this framework that we have constructed in the United States. Indigenous women make up the smallest minority of women in the United States. And because of this, they also suffer some of the highest levels of domestic violence, alcoholism, addiction. Um, you know, Native American people are actually the most likely to be killed by the police, despite having the lowest population numbers in the United States. One of the main challenges of achieving their goals is legitimizing the United States and the concept of a nation state as a whole. Mainly because a lot of these European societies, like I said, they either killed the Native Americans or they assimilated them into their Western society altogether. And let's see. And then one more thing that this article did talk about was that the term Native American itself is very political because I'm sure, like a lot of you guys know, a lot of Native American people do not identify as Native American. They simply identify with their nation, their respective nation and tribe. Especially in the United States. So the term Native American is often one that is used more politically as opposed to racially, in terms of self-identity. And this, political identity is useful because it's able to band together most Native American nations and tribes together towards a common goal. However, it's also very controversial because, like I said, a lot of Native Americans do not want to identify politically in their common, because they all have different struggles, they all have different classes, they all have different histories. I think one of the biggest problems with discussing Indigenous Americans in Western society is that they're just too overgeneralized. And then the way this plays into feminism is it's very difficult to. I understand that it's necessary to unite different peoples in a common struggle, minorities, LGBT, to achieve their goals, but at the same time it's also very controversial because you have to be respectful of people's identities. So that summarizes both of these articles that I read. They were both very interesting. I learned a lot. Capitalism and reproduction, I never thought about it in that framework, so that was something that was very enlightening to me. I learned a lot about indigenous feminism. Obviously, I have a huge interest in indigenous rights. I think focusing on indigenous feminism will be something that I'll be interested in this course if it becomes an option. I greatly appreciate you guys tuning into my critical reflection vlog. Have a great summer. I look forward to seeing you guys in a couple of weeks, and enjoy the rest of your days.